Good evening. Good evening and welcome very, very much to Conversations, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the program this evening Dr. Lionel Tiger. And Dr. Tiger is a distinguished professor of anthropology with the Rutgers University and has written, which to us is an extremely interesting book, a new book, entitled The Manufacture of Evil. We'd like to show you it here right at the outset. And Lionel Tiger, welcome very, very much to Conversations indeed.
Hello.
It's a very interesting book, I would say, The Manufacture of Evil, and it deals with, and I wonder if you could share with us the gestation of the book and so forth, it deals with the question of ethics in the modern era against the industrial development in a world where most of our ethical systems are very anciently rooted and so forth. But maybe you could share a little bit of the gestation of the book,
Sure.
when you got the idea.
Well, the subtitle is Ethics, Evolution, and the Industrial System, and basically the book deals with those three elements, a kind of triangle of forces. First of all, we have an ancient primate, that's us, perhaps 2-3 million years in formation, and certainly broadly unchanged for 40,000 years, but basically established a 250,000 years ago. And we have an industrial system which is at most 200 years old, barely 10 generations old. And we have an ethical system that we use, the Judeo-Christian system, Buddhism, Islam, Confucianism, and so on, all of which are rooted in pastoral, shepherd society, and small farm agriculture of a couple of 5,000 years ago.
Yeah,
And so we've got an ancient ape, us, with an evolution in a very small-scale society of maybe 30 to 100 people, hunting, gathering mainly, living in an industrial community which has produced no ethics of its own.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Well, I tried to think of one, and the only thing I could think of that was a sort of genuine ethic, but it was really an anti-ethic, was Marxism, which was a cry of pain, and then of course California talk, which is a whole other kind of issue, and it serves as an ethic there, which is interesting, and I don't mean to run it down, but and at the same time we're using basically an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, all that shepherd talk that I suspect was created by the thinkers and the political leaders of the time during the convulsion of moving from hunting and gathering to agriculture.
Do you think the ancient ethics, as you say, have more or less, in a certain sense, served us well up until when? The Industrial Revolution? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, they're basic, rooted principles that have a longevity because they're by wisdom of some way or another they've been able to latch on to given human characteristics and so forth? Or how well have they served us throughout the long history, let's say up until the modern era, before the Industrial Revolution?
Well, one characteristic of the pastoral agricultural ethics is that it's highly seasonal based.
All right,
It's constrained by the weather and by the calendar, and that has its own majesty, its own cautious pattern, its own opportunity to move, but not too far, not too fast. And therefore, in a sense, time is a protection. It's like a callus that forms. And those ethics were based on those sorts of systems. The scale of communities was smaller. Again, we did not have the kind of enormous population blocks that we now have, certainly not as densely congregated and as interactively dense, that is, where you could phone everybody in the world just by pressing one and then a series of numbers on your telephone. All that is relatively new. And then there's what I think we have to see is the bureaucratization of intimacy, which is the turning of what used to be relationships with uncles, say, into now relationships with psychiatrists or other nominated experts. And so in a curious way, the agricultural ethical pattern seemed to work fine. It may still be working fine, except that it doesn't seem to please us. That is, we're chafing under it. And I suspect that in fact it doesn't work. That is, as I point out in the book, one of the real shifts that has occurred, I think, in the industrial pattern is the decline of kinship. That is, the family is no longer really the acceptable location for people's lives. You can't hire your cousin.
What's this, or tribalism?
Nationalism is sort of acceptable, but tribalism is not, and familism is certainly not.
Or that extended family that used to be so important.
And of course there's no fair way and no feasible way of using that principle very effectively. And one consequence, I think, is that parents and everybody at schools know that virtually every member of the community is a kind of independent contractor. And we see it in very many ways. I have a chapter in the book called The Psycho-Industrial Complex, which tries to show that even the science of psychology is in fact deeply married to the industrial system, and in fact it originated when the industrial system did in the late 1800s.
Yeah, many things of the modern experience did come of a piece, didn't
That's
they?
right.
Yeah.
And one of the characteristics of psychology is its attention to psychological testing, which is really the study of, or the manifestation or the revelation of individual differences. And so from the time kids are 1 or 2, they're already figuring out these little idiot tests, what my students call multiple guess questions, and punching holes in cards or filling in little bubbles in an exam. And until they're 18 or 19, they're producing test behavior. They have to respond to tests, and they get evaluated by these impersonal tests created by machines, sent off to the educational testing service in Princeton, and a note comes back printed by another computer saying you're X number, you're in the 48th percentile and 90th percentile, whatever it is. And this is supposed to reflect your basic ethic, not your ethic, rather your essence.
Yes, right.
It's supposed to be a culture-free test. So essentially, it's quality control by the industrial system of the individual product, that is to say, the person. And that person then has to become a contractor and sell his or her life cycle to the system without any help. Family can't intervene. The church can't intervene. Even the old boy or the old girl network can't intervene, though these do. Nevertheless, I think there is a new kind of individualism that that really requires, or that is required by the system, which can't handle large blocks of people. It's got to deal with individuals. That is why, for example, if you go to apply for a job, it's illegal to be asked, do you have any children? Are you married? Do you have an uncle? All of these questions are not acceptable because, and I can understand why, and I agree that they shouldn't be asked. Nevertheless, everyone does have an uncle. Everyone does have something, and yet the system really makes it impossible to acknowledge what is the reality of a person's life, namely that it doesn't stop at 9 and start at 5.
Yeah, right.
There is an interaction. And I think the people who really had to face this problem have been women entering the labor force, particularly women with children.
Maybe because they entered the labor force so late on, in the sense where so many of these technologies were with full force able to exert themselves in terms of the sociological organization of things.
Indeed, because the men had always
just happened yesterday, really, in the human experience.
Well, the men had always been able to deal with this individualist pattern, in part because there was somebody at home to deal with this other sphere, the domestic sphere. But if there's nobody at home, then there's no domestic sphere. And I think it's a major shift. And again, as I point out in the book, it has rather interesting ethical consequences.
Yes, it certainly does.
For example, if you're working in an office and you, as you may, live in New York, in Manhattan, if you live in rental accommodation, the chances are 50% of the population, you're one of the 50% of the population that lives alone.
Lives alone now, which is a unique pattern.
Absolutely unique, and very
historical experience of this republic or the world.
Of the world, indeed. And so your home is where you live, but your emotional home, the people around you may well be at work.
Do you think there's a great deal of alienation in the modern experience?
Well, there is and there
isn't.
Or is it
increasing?
I don't know if it's increasing. Certainly loneliness is, in the sense that people live alone. We know that's well documented. The number of people living alone in households increases each year, according to the census, and it's a rather large and substantial and very significant increase. Many people are widows and widowers, of course. That accounts for some of it, but others are people who are normally in the phase of life when they'd be surrounded by other people.
Yeah, and you had a bit in your chapter where there was something like in your book where only 8% of the people fit the normal nuclear family idea of the father out earning with the mother at home and the children. There's a very few people fit that idealized pattern that is the one that we're striving for collectively, but seem not to be able to arrive at in reality.
And around which many of our systems are still based, such as the idea that children go home and somebody helps them with their homework, and and they can therefore progress in school and so on. Housing patterns have been based on that. Commuting patterns have been partly based on that. And now we find that it's just not so easily operated, and everyone feels the stress and strain of it. This is not to say there's an easy alternative, of course. Nevertheless, I suspect that the changes in the past 2 or 3 generations have been enormous when we consider, to come back to this model of agriculture as one of the formative features of our ethical patterns. I dare say that maybe half or more of the people watching this program are no more than 2 or 3 generations away from agriculture. That is, their parents or grandparents, or certainly great-grandparents, were involved in the agricultural community.
Yeah.
And so being in the industrial community is very new, and I suspect that we have not really thought this through in a kind of simple-minded way. You asked about the gestation of my book. I really tried to look at this in a very even crude and simple-minded, very blocked-out way to ask, how did we get here? What tools are we using? And what's the critter that we're trying to deal with, which is ourselves?
Yeah, and what's the evil in the title? Manufactured evil.
Well, the evil is what we make when we don't really want it. That is, in the old days, the devil did the evil and would have horns and a funny suit and so on, and willfully and with enjoyment produced evil. That was the devil's job, his or her, I don't know. It was his or her job. Now the evil is done in a kind of faceless, curious, almost unmeant way. Corporations will decide that they should do this or that, and as a consequence, rivers get flooded with poison. A government bureaucracy decides that it would be easier to send a certain document one way or another, and it turns out 200,000 people are no longer quite eligible for some benefit that they need. Marketing people helping a car company get a certain design in place will say it looks much better if you have the knobs facing this way, and then people start hitting their bodies against the knobs that stick out, and suddenly somebody realizes bad design, that the good design is not the primary requirement of the marketing people. But it's not that they wanted people to be hurt against the dashboards. It's just that their corporate responsibility was to sell more cars, and that was a decent thing to do, and it's what they were paid for. And the manufacture of evil has to do with all those curious things that I suspect are the result of a system we haven't thought through, which has produced evils that we are not content with for reasons which are really not necessary. And so what I've tried to do in a series of chapters is look at substantial areas of the social system, the psychological industries, for example, the family system. Let's take the family system just for a moment.
Well, yeah, you've been particularly interested in that.
Well, for example, if a woman in this country is working and she has a baby and she wants to get benefits from the government for maternity leave, she has to apply for disability benefits.
That's the only way she can get them.
That's the only way she can get them. But what she has is, in fact, an ability.
Yeah, right.
And so what the community has done in a weird, almost surreal way, is taken the great achievement of any species, which is to reproduce, defined it legally as a disability, and then forced people who are suddenly perhaps having their first child and feeling wonderful about it to sign a disability benefit check. Now, first of all, it's just aesthetically displeasing, but it also reflects a problem in the system itself, that it has not yet worked out a way to wholeheartedly embrace the processes, the real processes of life. And in order to protect the notion that everyone is treated equally in the workplace, men and women, and not to allow men to feel that women have an extra opportunity to take time off by having babies, which is, I suspect, the legal origin for the whole thing. Now, that part of the population that does bear babies is defined as having a disability. Well, that I take to be an evil. because I think it corrodes self-respect, it corrodes public notion of decency, and yet nobody meant badly out of it. It just is an artifact of a system itself.
And this new system that we have, this new sociological reality, as it were, is largely the result of the Industrial Revolution itself and some of the demands of the industrialization and the information technology processes that we've been growing almost exponentially in this modern experience.
Well,
we haven't been able to think through in a systematic way the implications of the technology that we've been putting out and creating new systems sufficiently.
Certainly we've tried to think them through. For example, I have a friend who happens to be a currency trader, and he does very, very well doing it, but I remember a couple of summers ago, even before the currency business got even as intense as it's been recently, saying that he was complaining about his situation, and he was trying to get together all the currency traders in the world to take a day off, to decide that Friday or Thursday or Sunday or Saturday or one day a week was off, because as it stands now, you trade currency 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
So if you're really in that business, and if you've got a risk exposure, which is the name of the game, you can never let up.
Yeah.
And it's rather like
Look,
having...
this is too much.
That's right. Yeah. So people are aware of the problem, and we can see what happens as in the crash of Wall Street last month, when suddenly everything just begins to happen very quickly, and there's no time to reflect on what the causes or consequences of anything are, and so the whole system just sort of tumbles because it really is going too quickly.
It's a very frightening kind of prospect, particularly when you think the same kind of computer systems are built into our geopolitical arrangement of things and so forth, unfortunately, increasingly, that are triggered to atomic bombs and other kinds of such things. People are concerned that technology is intervening without the human dimension of decision-making sufficiently able to have a play.
Yes, except that from I've had some connections with people in that military world, and I gather that even if all the computers said that the Russian missiles are on their way, and that in order for us to send our missiles over to retaliate against them for what we know by computer and therefore by truth is happening, before we fire off the missiles, we would still call up a retired tap dancer from Hollywood to ask his views on the matter.
Oh, sure. Yeah, right.
And the White House would be called, and then there would be all the inevitable skirmish there.
Yeah, maybe the real problem is that we got the weapons themselves, or the conditions. Robert Lifton's written eloquently, and others, on the psychological implications of living in a world of such incredible technological power and technological, almost Promethean capabilities developed relative to a relatively quieter, more impotent time, perhaps, in terms of our ability to have technology affect us. So it is a time of great challenge, right?
Well, you see, again, my hope for the system is still that we have at the center of this a rather cautious, rather kind of charming, rather quirky, rather incompetent primate, namely ourselves, having to mess through, muddle through, figure out what to do, forgetting its keys, doing all those sorts of things, and that has a quality of self-protection in it. Another example, if I may, there was, as you may remember, a tragedy in Kansas City when a Hyatt Hotel catwalk fell down. And that, I gather, was one of the first major buildings designed by a computer. And the reason that it fell down was that, I gather, again, that most architects, when they build a building, they're scared, malpractice or whatever, and they're also just prudent. They build in a tremendous amount of redundancy. They make it too big, too strong, and so on. The computer, of course, calculated exactly the maximum number of people who would be walking on that catwalk at any one time, took that into account, and had the specifications created, which the contractors followed, little knowing that there'd be 600 drunken conventioneers doing the boogaloo on a catwalk all at once, which
couldn't even handle that.
No computer would ever have estimated that, because it's not in a computer's program to have large-scale boogaloos.
To have chaos or synergies and things that couldn't be able to be foreseen.
That's right. And so the thing fell down. And I suspect that, again, that if we, which is again what I'm interested in this book, if we keep paying attention to who we are and to the evolved skills that we have, then we reduce the risk of allowing things to go thoroughly out of control simply because we remain in control.
Yeah, okay, well, that's a point that we wanted to come back to. It's really interesting. We have to take a break right now. We'll come back right on that point if you don't mind. So we are, again, talking with Lionel Tiger, author of this interesting new book, Manufacture of Evil. We'll be coming right back. Please do stay tuned. Thank you.
How do you find out when an administration is corrupt? How do you find out when a government is hiding the truth? How do you find out about those who would like you not to find out? To become better informed about the role of a free press and how it protects your rights, contact the First Amendment Center.
Do you have your passport?
For the third time, yes.
You have everything? Kids, relax. If we weren't grown-ups, they wouldn't have let us join the Peace Corps.
Peace Corps. It's creating food systems in Africa, building homes in Costa Rica, and fighting malaria in Asia. It's teaching math and learning French. It's working side by side. It's been tough, but for 25 years, the Peace Corps has been making a difference in the world.
Mom, Dad, I'm so proud of you.
Peace Corps, the toughest job you'll ever love.
Back again with Lionel Tiger now, and you said the human element can stay in control. I wonder, if I could ask you a general comprehensive question if I could. I wonder how you feel. Are you generally optimistic, or are you sometimes pessimistic concerning broad general terms, the human prospect as we contemplate things here in the year 1987?
I wrote a book some years ago called Optimism, the Biology of Hope, in which I made the argument that by and large humans have got to have a kind of moderate chronic optimism because otherwise we'll despair, and that we have a brain which is sufficiently imaginative and skillful that it can look for opportunities for despair everywhere, rather like paranoids who see enemies everywhere, and sometimes, of course, that's realistic. But I suspect that if we don't have that moderate optimism, we really can't see our way through any situation, because clearly the world is full of germs and viruses and traffic accidents and crises in Afghanistan. Just read your paper every day. Nevertheless, we do have an ability to, as Jimmy Durante said, accentuate the positive. And it's that overestimate of the odds in our favor which I think is a very important characteristic of
without being Pollyannish.
Without being Pollyannish, because that mobilizes the action systems. Now, whether I'm optimistic myself, I personally happen to be that kind of person. I see the cup as half full generally, and I think that that's a reasonable assessment of the situation. What interests me about what's happening currently is that yes, there is a real concern about ethics, and that concern about ethics is not just a question of hanging the bad guys or screaming imprecations against people who might become bad, but I think it's a crisis or a feeling of crisis in the overall fitness of what we're doing. And it's a kind of moral ecology, I think, that we're dealing with here. And so my book, which is about ethics, is really a kind of moral ecological effort as well, an effort really to see how we can make our current circumstances fit the ones that we evolved in
a way that we can see problems. If we look at it, there are spasticities, there are inefficiencies, there are perhaps unnecessary sufferings on the part of the human society that we might be able to alleviate, or?
Well, we might be able to alleviate them, but also we might be able to become more practical about not creating problems in the first place. To go back to the example I gave earlier of the disability benefit for the new mother. That's a problem which will have to be solved, but it's one that we created by failing to look at our noses right on our faces. Now, there are broader issues that certainly have to do, for example, with the whole question of social scale. I'm very interested in trying to adapt the idea of the quality circle in industry, the American idea which was taken to the Japanese, which they use so effectively, taking that idea of the quality circle and turning it into a notion of a moral quality circle. That is, breaking the large labor force down into small groups, each of which has both a responsibility and an opportunity to make legitimate and realistic and actionable moral decisions. And so the whole question of the moral direction or ethical direction of a work group can be as much affected by the activity of its members as productivity levels or quality levels. And so I think there are ways that are quite simple, not necessarily simple-minded, but simple, robust, down-to-earth, and which make use of the skills that we actually have, that we've evolved.
Do you think the systems that we have, industrial, educational, sociological systems, allow the flowering of human potentiality, or is a great deal of human potential, either emotionally or intellectually or in other terms, able to find its full expression, or is it stifled by the system and, let's say, just creativity and other kinds of human characteristics that are of the highest order? Are they able to find a flowering in a way that you could
Well, I
feel,
think...
or it's all relative, of course, but it just...
Yes, I think I might disagree with the notion of the finest, the best and the brightest of the human capacity. I think a good cup of tea is great, and I suspect that it's as important to be able to have some good stewed beans as it is to develop an opera. That is, I think that what we have done with our particular kind of culture is create a set of technologies of communication and of the arts which have disenfranchised most people so that they can't get a sense of the real pleasure and the real virtues of their day-to-day activities. If we go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people like William Morris were saying that we had to take the industrial arts, the daily arts, and turn them into arts, acknowledge them as arts, rather than the fine arts, so-called, which are the desks of dictators and the paintings of kings, all of those things which are obviously great. Nevertheless, they could easily be seen to be alienating the people who may literally find that making a nice molded jelly dessert is, for them, very satisfying.
Absolutely, yeah. Or much less cabinet makers or artisans and all kinds of people who used to put a great deal of skill and human activity into the things that they did, found themselves in time maybe on an assembly line with specialization coming into high dimension to where they became alienated from the productive process itself in the routine that they were doing, which in a sense would then make it difficult for them to have a full sense of creative, unalienated sort of relationship to their work.
That's right.
It's characteristic of the modern experience in large measure.
Yes,
in
except
the industrialization process.
Except some organizations are recognizing that they have to reverse the process. The famous case of Volvo, which has one group of people build a whole car. Instead of having the car start at point A and go right through to point Z with little bits and pieces added here and there, one work unit is responsible for, if not the entire car, at least for the body or whatever, but there is a sense of people rotating jobs, moving to different functions, having more interesting work, having some say in what other people can do and shouldn't do, and so on. And
you don't think it is that the process itself, the industrialization process, the specialization process, the breaking every function down into its part, is inherently, in and of itself, alienating, whether they shift from one nut to another or something, what they're doing, it's inherently alienating the work process, the job process is. And I wonder, how are we going to deal with factories that are robotically created, where
well,
they have automobiles can come out that was all done without a human hand input to it, with great precision and so forth, engineering precision.
Well, we have to again acknowledge the very brief period.
And people have, since they're there turning the nuts, they have no time to make that nice molded dessert because they can't be concerned with the human scale of things because they're so caught up by this great monolithic
well,
machine.
some of these robots can do what bench presses and pile drivers and other machines spared us from having to do, and I'm not sure that's such a bad idea.
Yeah, right. All right.
But if we step back for a moment, I have again a chapter in the book called 10 Generations That Changed the World, and that deals with the evolution of the idea of management. There didn't used to be managers. There were people who ran things. And then managers emerged, in fact, not even 10 generations ago, apparently around the turn of the century again when all of this happened, and many of them with Frederick Taylor, many of the first managers, certainly in the United States and probably in the world, were engineers, and they were from West Point. So you had an engineering background and a military background cohering to essentially come to dominate the industrial background. And that produced the situation you just described in good measure. And that then was passed around the world in modernization courses, business administration schools, set up courtesy of the University of Michigan, University of California, AID, all those sorts of things. And now this metaphor of behavior in which all the effort comes from the top down. The managers, the engineers, the theoreticians break the job down and they give it to people to do. That's come to dominate. Now, what the Japanese did was they operated the other way around. They started from the bottom and said, tell us what you're doing and then we'll put it all together. And that's obviously been extremely successful. Now, I'm not about to say that they've done everything perfectly and that it's a trouble-free community. I wouldn't, of course, say that. But I think that your point has to do with a very curious shift in the notion that human behavior could be managed as if it were another resource.
Yeah. Human resources, yeah, right.
Well, human resource management, which is what the course is typically called at business schools. And humans are not resources to be managed in that way because they just get ornery or they quit or they pull out their energy and they only do half the work. And somehow we've not figured out a way of dealing with people's labor which makes use of what I suspect most people have, which is a feeling that since I'm here I might as well have a good time and do it well and get some good work done and maybe we'll get a bit more money and it's more fun than being surly and recalcitrant and small-mindedly criminal about something. Basically, we know that as with sports, for example, when a team has a good coach and when things are working well, they have more fun, they play better, and fewer injuries, and everyone is happier. But when everyone starts to get greedy and nasty and the coach doesn't understand the George Steinbrenner problem, when you have a complete fool operating a ball team and undermining the manager's position when it's the manager who's the moral accountant of the team who understands what the different players are contributing that never show up in the statistics, well, then you get the sort of situation you get with the New York Yankees, for example. Well, that Steinbrenner model, I think, is a very useful one because it shows exactly how you can do everything wrong. And this is in what's supposed to be a game, but it's not. It's bitter.
You said before about the woman who had the baby and had to go to disability in order through a tax-supported governmental system to have income, apart from the fact most people, in order to gain income for life's purposes, they have to pay rent, buy food, and buy automobiles and so forth. They have to have what they call a job, some sort of a function by which they then are able to claim income for life's purposes. And yet we live in a society where increasingly it's technology in a ratio with human input to overall production that is that which creates, particularly as we see robotics and other kinds of things in the material world, but very, very few people within the general society gain income by having some ownership of the technology which is increasingly responsible for production. Do you think that's a problem, that there's a mismatch between the way products are made and the way the income is distributed, in that 5% of the population virtually own all of the technology, and most people have only a labor relationship to a productive process, whose overall contribution to that process is increasingly less in percentage terms in terms of the relation to technology. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
There's a problem of distribution of income by a technologically oriented productive system.
It's really another version of the medieval system in which the landlords owned the land and the fiefs were obligated, the fiefdoms were obligated to
Norton
work.
Simon was bought in 40,000 lives. They were just like serfs. They were just transferred around by the management. They just went along with the with the territory, as it were. Yeah.
So that is certainly an issue, and that, of course, goes to very complicated political problems, obviously, and some problems which may well only be solved bitterly, as a matter of fact. There's clearly not going to be an agreeable, charming, happy way for those 5% of the population to be induced to give away their wealth. Obviously, they're not. And the English Labour Party tried, and various governments in Europe have tried, and still the distribution of wealth doesn't change drastically, though the distribution of income may, but not the ownership of wealth. And the French tried a wealth tax, and the British have got a confiscatory tax as well. Still, it both of these societies remain relatively hierarchical. But I think that that's a chronic issue. We could have said the same about the Middle Ages. I think your point, however, is very important in that dynamic sense, which is that the scale is bigger and the stakes are higher because these factories that are now owned by a family in living in the Hudson Valley somewhere may now have a market that's worldwide. Say they take the Corning Glass Company. It's the Houghton family that has shareholdings in that, large holdings. Well, they sell glass all over the world, unlike a farmer in the Berkshires in 1890. You might be lucky to sell to Boston.
Yeah, right.
And so what we've got now is a scale of potential distinction that's far greater and far more dramatic than ever before. And it's also now magnified in terms of the so-called North-South dialogue and the other painful inequities that we see in the economic world internationally.
Do you think on a world scale, we're 5 billion, or apparently just crossed 5 billion collectively on the human scale, on the whole of the world, there's a certain kind of relationship of the members of our collective society to the material realities? Do you think in terms, given the technology to alleviate suffering, to bring comfort, to bring security, to bring other kinds of betterment, as it were, of the human condition, that we're making progress in terms of the number of people that are able to be benefited by our collective technological efforts and so forth? And are we moving ahead? More and more people are becoming, in a certain sense, close to or near being haves, as it were, in terms of our ability to provide living, real life support?
I'm not sure if we're certainly comparatively we're not. That is, the haves have gotten more havier, and the have-nots are, by comparison, much more irritated, and that's because the discrepancies between the wealthy and the poor continue to expand for the reasons you described earlier about the ownership of technology. I think my own sense is that one real improvement that has occurred rather recently in the world, maybe even in the past decade, has been a rather surprising and rapid and increasing contempt for ideology. That is, the belief somehow that ideas will set us free independently of action related to these ideas, or independently of a practical test of these ideas. That idea, that notion, that ideological notion, has really suffered in this country, as well as in the Soviet Union, as well as in China, as well as in much of Eastern Europe, in South America.
Just in the last decade or so.
In the last decade. I think the lure of Marxism, which was completely understandable given its emphasis on equity and brotherhood and so on, obviously for many countries, I think, did not translate into productive equity. It might have yielded a kind of aesthetic sense of equity, but not productive equity.
So pragmatism or practicalities have come back into the fore then?
Yes, but you see, I think ideology is a real danger in the human species, again, because as I point out in the book, one of the things that we've done is to try to recreate a sense of community that we lost by becoming industrial figures, really independent contractors, is that we've jumped into ideological positions, and the ideology is a kind of surrogate family. And in fact, the words are very much family-oriented, brother, comrade, and so on, rather like religious words.
Or it might be trying to set up an alternate reality to a reality that is found to be very, very uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable, indeed. But I think also the notion that reality can be changed by ideology itself, as in the consciousness-raising idea, has proven to be merely a kind of luxurious Buddhist fantasy that doesn't work, and governments are plainly concerned to try to get things working and get them right. And my suspicion is that this whole Wall Street business recently has also reduced the ideological level. I think people got scared, and they realized that the system was not automatically perfectible. It was not a souffle that would keep rising forever. And the severity and the nature and the unexpected nature of the event, again, may have caused some people to lose some of their ideological certainty. And I'm not being Pollyannish here again, but I think that there's and it's appropriate around Thanksgiving time. I think people are prepared to talk turkey now in a way that there was too much emotionality before to do.
Yeah, well, that might be possibly signaling good for all of the world society if some of the far out stringent kind of ideological positions could find some sort of middle ground. We have a summit meeting coming up between Mr. Gorbachev and our own nation, which might bode possibly well if there could be not too strictly taken ideological views, and a little bit better ability to come to the middle somewhere. Well, maybe we could talk about that if you could hold it for just a second. We're talking again with Lionel Tiger, author of the interesting new book, Manufacture of Evil. We'll have to take a little break here. We'll be coming right back. Please stay tuned. Thank you.
In our country, where physical illness gets the most advanced medical treatment, a disease that affects 35 million Americans goes virtually untreated.
Why don't you just get up and pull yourself together? Snap out of it.
The disease is mental illness, a disease that's often misunderstood, so its victims wind up neglected, isolated.
There is nothing more I can do for you.
But mental illness can be treated once you learn to see the sickness. For an informative booklet, call the American Mental Health Fund.
There was a time when an 18-year-old couldn't vote. A time when there was no meaningful way for young adults to express their opinions. What changed that? The 26th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution, the words we live by.
Back again with Lionel Tiger. It's interesting, we picked it up, the idea of the diminution of ideology as a stance in the last 10 years or so from those positions. We have been living rather an ideological existence with our president using terms such as evil empire in the past and so forth, but there seems to be now, on the eve of Mr. Gorbachev coming to visit for a summit here in the United States for the first time, perhaps a diminution of the ideological dialectical expressions of finding evil and so on. Do you take some heart in the fact that people of the world perhaps are able to talk to one another somewhat more than they have been able to, or not?
Generally, as a primatology type, I would say
right.
that the more contact, the better, simply because, and the more low-level, that is to say simple contact, that is one-to-one chatting contact, the better, because it creates a level of reality that it's difficult to achieve by writing letters and memos and giving speeches at the United Nations in front of a teleprompter.
As important as all that is.
As important as it is, or as displacing as all that is. It may avoid some of the real issues sometimes. But in any case, to come back to the summit business, what's interesting about Gorbachev is how extraordinary his impact has been when he's not really done anything of any astonishment. He's just talked a bit honestly and said a few obvious things, and he's mixed with a few people, and he's had a good smile, and he looks sort of healthy, and he is prepared to treat himself with a certain sense of humor, and he's become a kind of international hero for that reason. And
seems to be genuinely devoted to the proposition of doing something about the nuclear weapons.
Well, I
in the
think,
minds of many.
yes.
Hopefully, let's hope.
I suspect that the whole, I know, having been in the Soviet Union once, I know that the reality of war is very different for them than it is for us here.
20 million people is a lot of people to lose.
Well, a lot of people to lose, but not only that. For example, on your way into to Moscow from the airport, there's a memorial showing where the Germans were stopped, and it's sort of where LaGuardia Airport is, and it makes you very quickly realize that these people have a very different experience.
Yeah, it is interesting. He gave a speech back, if I may, on September 17th, where he said that there was, to give increased, they paid their back dues and they gave increased validity to the United Nations, and in a certain sense in his speech was very interesting. He said, in a Marxian analysis, again, back to that counter cry to the ethical need for something in a modern expression, he said that in their sense that the material realities are changing, that there's a changing of material realities, moving toward increased ability to see sufficiency or surplus as a context within which human institutions could be formulated within a Marxian context, which gave them an ability, at least in the words as he was putting them forth, to see a transformation from the historical condition in which our nations have confronted one another and so forth, and was pleading that we begin to think in terms of a changing material reality that makes new ethics possible. Does that make any sense to you, or
well,
is it just Marxist? But the Marxists do have a view of emerging surplus capability that technology might bring to us and so forth.
Well,
a way out of the dilemmas that
certainly their society
in which our ethical base has been grounded.
But their society is still having trouble producing the material goods that they want, and I think they recognize that they might have greater success with that if they change their system, which is now at the low point of bureaucratic malfunction. But
I think he was thinking on a world scale.
No, I know. I was coming to that because obviously what he was reflecting was the cost of all these armaments, and what I suppose is, in a certain sense, an almost majestic unreality to the whole military encounter. I talk with students about this, and I say to them, "How many of you have ever seen a Russian?" And hardly any have ever seen one of the people that their tax money is going to defend themselves against. And the same is true, of course, with Russians and Americans. That is, there's a quality of almost religiosity in the Cold War, or whatever, how you want to define it now, that's really quite striking, and that really requires an anthropological viewpoint, because a political scientist, I think, would not appreciate how truly and fantastically splendid it is as a creation, that we have these two nations that are as far apart as could be, pointing all these guns at each other, and we really have no interests to fight over except the Persian Gulf, and then
we might even be able to settle something there.
I'm sure.
It might be that the conditions for peace could be seen for the first time, perhaps. Could we be so optimistic?
You see, here again, I think
peace would break out in the earth. That would be the basis of a new ethic, or something is heralding this as a non-ordinary time, as it were. You're signaling the need for a new ethic, and I don't know. I didn't mean to interject. But this is a time some sort of qualitative transformation is sensed in the human
it's
experience.
Possible if there can be, I think, a satisfactory method of simplifying the various structures. For example, we've come a long way from the Cuban Missile Crisis when
scared.
But not only that, when Kennedy and Khrushchev were communicating, the way they did this was by Kennedy sending a message to the State Department. The State Department would then send a message to the American Embassy in London. A motorcyclist would take the message to the Russian Embassy across London, and then it would be beamed to Moscow. And then, of course, everyone said we have to have a hotline, and of course we do. So, in a sense, we're becoming aware of the simplicity of some of our needs. And I don't mean, again, to be childish about this, but I suspect that human beings, being very, very skilled at interaction, we're great at interaction.
Gregarious, basically.
Gregarious, and in fact we're a gregarious mammal, and we do it exquisitely well. That's why we're so fascinated by theater and movies and television, because we're fascinated to watch people interact with each other in a delicate manner. Well, certainly in political terms, I suspect that, again, there are great skills at bay that have not yet been used, partly because every skill user is restrained by some official organization, the State Department or the Pentagon or the CIA or the equivalent in the Soviet Union, and it becomes difficult then for the independent or the individual operating as a hearty individual to function with another hearty individual. And that's why so many Americans were disturbed at what happened at the last summit in Iceland, because they thought that Ronald Reagan had gone off the rails, when in fact he was merely responding, I suspect, to another human being. He is, after all, an interactor.
Yes, very much so.
That was his job. He's not an actor, he's an interactor. In order to act well, you have to interact well.
Yeah, I guess maybe what we're getting at is whether or not back again to that notion of the material realities, or the technological development, or whether we're making progress in terms of technology, or whether Dickens used to say it was the worst and the best of times and so forth. We might have the same analogies we look about at homeless among ourselves, among a nation who has great riches, or a world that has great riches and material capability to bring and answer the ancient scourges, technological, knowledge base, and so forth. We have these things that could maybe perhaps spell a an alleviation of some of the ancient scourges and the conditions that have created created adversarial relationships among the peoples of the world. It could be seen perhaps even as we approach the time when we could perhaps destroy ourselves with the weapons of destruction, also have the means for creating a peaceful world looking maybe 2, 3 decades or 100 years out or something. This would be a transition point or a birth of a new time that would signal a new ethic. The new ethic that we live by came when agriculture was first created. We may be coming at the end of a cycle, and the new ethic is being heralded in keeping with a new emerging material reality or something. I don't know. Just trying to grasp for something that would sort of move us beyond where we are.
That's very interesting, because let's try to run ahead and fantasize about what might be the conditions of such a new ethic. One might well be that people should not have official communication, but they should have personal communication. That is, the summit conference should not be the unusual thing, it should be the usual thing. That the much vaunted exchange of artists and so on should be what always happens, not what unusually happens. That is, that the bureaucratic tail should no longer wag the pretty head of the puppy, as it were. That the the overall pattern should shift from an emphasis on the official power or official function in the community to the functions of individuals operating within obviously some constraints, but knowing that they have the responsibility and opportunity to make human connections about human problems.
Right, and perhaps in a humanly satisfying way between cross-cultural pollinization and a I don't know, a symphonic kind of blending of the human spirit. Might even beat the swords into plowshares or something.
Well, at the same time, to be realistic...
without being unrealistic.
No, I understand, but to be realistic as well as hopeful, it may well be that what we have to do also is accept, almost with a sense of humor, a certain chronic element of irritating warfare in some places, a certain chronic element of irritation, a certain chronic element of incompetence, a certain amount of disrepair in the system.
It might be good if we could see some of those things in almost Gilbert and Sullivan terms. Maybe,
well,
maybe. It might be a way to deal with some of them. Well, you know.
Well, just, yes.
You understand what I'm saying? Or
to see them as cartoons.
Theater, yeah, or something maybe, you know. Or
in any event, I suspect that part of the fruit of the ideological tree is a belief in perfection. And that, of course, is doomsday for human beings. We, again, as I said earlier, we keep forgetting our keys. And so we're just not that class of organism that's ever going to be perfect. And so we'd better give up on that and figure out ways to deal with the imperfections which are inevitable in any of the systems and any of the patterns of life that we sustain. And I suspect it's for that reason that I get encouraged by the ethical implications of a decline of ideology in that traditional sense that we've used it.
You're encouraged by that, right? Yeah, right. Encouraged by the fact that we have been that. Ideologies very often are used to counterpose against, we said before, a reality that is unacceptable to some people. Very often is done in the name of injustice and so forth. It's well enough to say if we have a status quo world, but we'd have to have a world of peace where not only would the institutions that we have and so forth be able to be appropriate to those who are, let's say, in a certain sense, comfortable, as it were now, but we'd also have to find the means by which the have-nots, as it were, could be brought up, perhaps without bringing the haves down. Is that a luxury that maybe a new emerging surplus capability might make available to us that hasn't been available to us in the historical experience, without hubris being brought onto the scene, as you used cleverly in your book? But do you understand?
Yes. Part of the problem, however, again, it must have to do with
so that all can win, in a way.
Well, the win-win situation is certainly possible, except that sometimes it might almost be more fruitful for there to be no relationship. That is, much of the early efforts by the rich countries to aid the poor doomed their agricultural systems. And people went in with a lot of money and a lot of technology to build tin can factories in countries that stopped growing anything to put into the tin cans.
And no sense of cultural concern.
And no sense of agricultural consistency. And so, in some sense, it might be better to leave bad enough alone rather than try to improve it using the theories and ethics of the society that may have created the problem in the first place.
Yeah, ideally we want something where we didn't have to feel as though we're impotent in terms of that. We'd be able to get some sort of a working that could work that question out in a humane and appropriate way. One doesn't want to feel as though we're impotent to the rest of the world
No,
or to
but
be
I
able
think
to do any good. I mean,
that's why
that's
the
an
appropriate...
anti-Vietnam thing probably served us very well, that we cannot do good in the world. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure. That's why the appropriate technology movement, as it were, is a useful one, because it deals with trying to get tools for other countries that are appropriate to their needs, and not ones that are artifacts of our own capacity or of our own needs. And so a certain amount of real humility and a belief also that small is tolerable. It doesn't have to be beautiful, or that somehow everything doesn't have to be the same, might make things a lot easier for the inevitable differences in human populations, given ecology, culture, climate, and so on. If we can actually welcome changes from our own patterns when we, if we're talking here about this culture, go abroad to try to help some other country.
That's right. It would be good if we could be able to present to those who are responsible for historical patterns some alternatives that they could feel comfortable with, so that the change could be, perhaps for the first time, the luxury of change where people could feel comfortable with a major change, but that if we could see a major change coming towards the conditions of peace, which seem to be almost the necessary conditions for 100 years, 200 years out for the species to survive, we're going to have to come to some reckoning with this technological place that we've come to now, which is, it seems to me, a time of potentially qualitative transformation, calling above all else for an ethic that might help us get to that point. And if I may say so, your book is a leading light in terms of helping to structure some of the major questions that we all have to address to try and meet this challenge, as it were. And I want to thank you very much for that.
No, thank you.
Not at all. It's a pleasure. And I'm sorry we're not out of time. We'll go on talking at great length. It's been your pleasure to have the Perceptions In, distinguished professor of anthropology at the Rutgers University and author of this extremely interesting new book, Harper and Row, the Manufacture of Evil. Highly recommended, of course. We thank you for viewing, and we do invite you here in Conversations to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back again next week. I'm afraid that's it for this particular segment. Dr. Tiger, Lionel, if I may, thank you once again very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good night. We'll see you next week.
To obtain videocassette copies of this or other programs from the Conversation series, dial 1-800-367-2120. 1-800-367-2120. We welcome your comments. Send them to Conversations with Harold Hudson Chandler, CMA, 226 West 26th Street, New York, New York, 10001.
Thank you.
Political science. Benjamin
Ben
Barber.
Barber, I don't know where.
He has a book out some time ago called Strong Democracy. Very interesting, thoughtful. Democracy.
Yeah. Where is he?
At Rutgers.
At Rutgers.